yeah, they're coming together. So it's the vice minister for.
Not infrequent. The security at the front, you can often. Yes. If we ran security, it'd be a little different. Unfortunately, they have their books. I'll wait for you to come.
I don't know if you remember something like when Chile, from Chile, with the main favor. Still, we are process of issues here. I listen to this for the decision.
Yes.
Yeah. Gracias.
No, I have. That's awful. I have.
So,
I'm done.
Francisca, I'm a facilitator, social development of Chile. Yes.
Are you based in Santiago?
Yes, no, because
Pasé un año en Chile. Está bien. Yo conocí tiempo en Santiago, pero pasé entonces niña. Puerto Montt, sí, y también estaba en Comparte. Pero venía Bolivia, esa área. Sorry. I'm being told that I should begin, and I was catching up about my favorite year of my life, which I spent in Chile. So, sorry, my apologies all. Good day, colleagues and friends, and welcome to this launch of the 2025 World Social Report. My name is Dan Burrell, and I serve as one of the representatives for the Baha'i International Community's United Nations office, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this gathering. This report comes at a crucial time at both the micro and macro levels. On the former, we have the second World Summit for Social Development taking place half a year from now. And the greater our understanding of what we've learned over the past 30 years of action on the Copenhagen Declaration, the more likely we are to achieve a successful outcome and accelerate the implementation of that declaration and, of course, the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. But perhaps at the more macro level, the world is at an inflection point. And as I was writing these remarks yesterday, I was thinking, how many inflection points have there been over the past, 15, 20 years? But I suspect that we all have a feeling that this inflection point is more inflecty than other inflection points. And there will be a dramatic change in how we approach development and peace and inclusion and inequality. But as the world endures this transition period, it helps me to remember that though devastating in their effects, the forces of disintegration tend to sweep away barriers that block humanity's progress, opening space for processes of integration to draw diverse groups together and open new opportunities for cooperation and collaboration. And I think this report demonstrates what some of those opportunities might look like. As new plans, as new initiatives and approaches are being developed, there's an evidence-based record of what has been working. And we know that the actions that are taken depend often on the ideas that are lying around. So I'm glad that these ideas are now more prominently lying around. And this is the power of the World Social Report as a menu of options based on solid evidence that can suggest to governments ways to improve the livelihoods of their citizens, lighting the way for equity, economic security, and solidarity. Finally, I'd like to highlight one element in the report that stood out to me. It says that this era of growing global interdependence requires a commitment to coordinated multilateral action. It calls out that competition between countries has created a race to the bottom, which can be counterproductive to the advancement of our shared goals. And I think this insight on its own can have profound implications for our work at the international level. So with this as a bit of my own humble framing and expression of my interest in the report, I have the pleasure of sharing a little bit about the run of show for the day. And I believe you all have access to the agenda, so I won't go into too much detail. But we'll begin with a few opening remarks, and thankfully you've already enjoyed mine. But we have remarks from our colleagues at DESA and UNU Wider, who have put this event together, followed by a presentation of the report from the writing teams. And then we'll have two respondents to that presentation and open dialogue. And then finally, I'll be back to offer a few concluding remarks at the end. So with that, as brief introduction, I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Charles Katoanga, who's the Director of the Division for Inclusive Social Development, DESA, to share his opening remarks. So over to you, Mr. Katoanga. And sorry, one item very briefly, if I could encourage us all to use our outdoor voices, because with high ceilings and microphones up there, it's helpful for those online when we project a little more. Sorry. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'll try my very best to speak as loud as I can. We were reflecting on the period of inflection, the ebbs and flows that humanity has had to endure, and we're hoping that this particular point, this particular period of transition is one that's going to be too long. So we remain optimistic. If you will allow me, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the Vice Minister of Social Development, Francesca Gallegos, joined us this morning. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, may I again thank Daniel Burrell, representative of the Baha'i International Community to the United Nations, for your warm welcome. Our sincere thanks to the Baha'i for graciously hosting our event this morning. Thanks also to all of you, whether you're joining us here in the room or from across continents, for being part of this event. Let me also extend our deepest appreciation to co-authors and close partners at UNU Wider. Wider's collaboration has been invaluable in shaping the 2025 edition of the World Social Report. The World Social Report has a long history. It was first published under the title Report on the World Social Situation in 1952. But this year's edition holds special significance for us, not only in its content, but in its timing. 2025 marks 30 years since the adoption of the Copenhagen Declaration and Program of Action on Social Development. And we'll see the convening of the second World Summit for Social Development in Doha this November. This anniversary and its convergence with the second World Summit provide a unique opportunity to not only take stock, but to move the needle forward on the social dimension of sustainable development. In response to this moment, the World Social Report 2025 offers a broad assessment of today's global social situation. It reviews progress in the core commitments made in Copenhagen to eradicate poverty, promote full employment and decent work, and foster social integration, while also examining the new realities of our time: persistent inequalities, deepening insecurity, eroding trust, and social polarization. In the report, we acknowledge that there have been meaningful gains, including in the fight against extreme poverty. We acknowledge that. But we also recognize that progress has often been too fragile and uneven. As a result, we are alarmingly off track to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its transformative goals. The report offers a clear, evidence-based assessment of today's social landscape and provides policy recommendations to overcome today's social challenges and accelerate progress in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Colleagues, our understanding of social progress has deepened since 1995. Take poverty, for example. We now see it more than just a lack of income. Today, we recognize poverty in its many dimensions, from access to education and healthcare to social participation and dignity. Today, we can trace the dynamics of poverty to understand when and why people fall into poverty and what helps them escape. Similarly, thanks to data innovations, we have more insight into the many dimensions of inequality. This richer understanding must shape our response. The World Social Report 2025 notes that today's social challenges require major transformations in policy, institutions, and mindsets. With this in mind, the report calls for a new policy consensus to accelerate and sustain social progress in the long term, one grounded in equity, economic security, and solidarity. We, ESSA, and UNU wider hope that this report will serve as a catalyst for dialogue, for collaboration, and above all, for action. I thank you for your attention. I now am pleased to give the floor to Ms. Patricia Justino, the Deputy Director of UNU wider. Patricia.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can hear me well. And thank you for the warm welcome. I wish I could be with you in New York, but instead I'm reaching you from a very lovely Finnish evening. Now we have daylight until very late. So, despite being far away, I'm delighted to be with you for the launch of this World Social Report 2025. This is the first time that UNDESA and UNU wider collaborate in this important publication, and us at UNU wider are extremely honored to have joined this team. It's been an absolute pleasure working together for the last almost 2 years in the production of this report. And as been mentioned before, this report could not be more timely. I'm also told it's a very timely day for launch. As I'm told, today is the International Day for Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. We hope that the messages in the report resonate with the message of this day. As been mentioned, we recognize that indeed the world has made extraordinary social and economic progress over the last 30 years. That's undeniable. Yet, what we do see when we talk to ordinary people is most people in today's world do not feel that progress. And what the report does is discuss why this is happening and the consequences of such perceptions for the overall social fabric of societies and the future of multilateralism itself. What we're observing is a global concern and is also interlinked with complex global challenges from climate change to increases in conflict, pandemic, economic recessions that we face over the last years. And what each individual is feeling is the result of these global changes that require global solutions. However, instead of striving to find global solutions that work for all, what we're observing currently is a rise of nationalistic policies, inward-looking governments across the world. And we see these evolving daily. We observe on every day a rise of the idea of us versus them, this mentality, the spread of disinformation, and a growing support for extreme political views. And what it means is the international community is now at an extremely critical junction. And I do agree with the point made before by Daniel that this critical junction feels very different from what came before. We are off track to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And we will not be on track if we do not find ways of urgently increasing global cooperation and coordinated action before the vicious cycle that is documented in the report becomes irreversible. But in times of crisis are also times of opportunities. And then the time is now to find those opportunities together. And the ultimate aim of this report is a call for such action. I thank you, and I look forward to the discussion that follows.
Thank you, Patricia. Please, colleagues, let me come in. So before moving on, let me just thank everybody here for coming and everybody online as well, and pass some housekeeping announcements before we hear from the reports team. So after we hear from the team on the report's main findings, we will have an opportunity for Q&A. So everybody will have first some expert discussion from Ms. Shara Razavi, Director of the Social Protection Department at ILO, and then also from Mr. Andrew Shepard, Director of the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network. After that, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A, so please in the room, feel free to raise your questions at that time. And for everybody online, you have access to the Q&A feature on Zoom, so please feel free at any point to drop your questions there. So now, without further ado, please let me hand back the floor to the team, to Patricia, Marta, lead author of the report in UNDESA, and Maren also leading the writing team at UNDESA. Please, Patricia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And now back with the findings of the report. So I will not be able to see the slides and the screen at the same time, but I will. But I think we can start. We can go to the first slide, and I'll start it from there. Whoever is moving the slides, I think we can move one more. Okay, so the starting point of the report is the observation that indeed, despite fast declines in extreme poverty, improvements in health, in education, in connection, cooperation, etc., well-being over the last 30 years, many people across the world feel that life is worse now than it was 50 years ago. In fact, 60% of the world population feels in that way, that life now is worse or has not improved. This is the conundrum that we had tried to understand in this report. Why is that? And there seem to be three key reasons why this may be the case. The first is about insecurity. So people around the world report they're feeling increasingly insecure, economically insecure. While poverty has declined, the risk of falling into poverty is very much present in many people's lives, both in poor and rich countries. In fact, millions, if not billions of people are one shock away from falling into poverty. Unemployment remains insecure in many developing countries and is increasingly insecure in developed countries. The second point is the fact that the benefits of progress have not been shared by everyone. Social and economic inequalities persist, and in many cases they have worsened, as we report. Currently, 2/3 of the world population live in countries where income inequality has increased since 1995. And finally, the third reason has to do with trust. Economic insecurity and frustration with status quo, the perceptions that life has not become better, is fueling distrust and inflaming social and political divisions, both old and new. And we see that in the news almost on a daily basis. So if we move next slide, eventually what we are seeing is a vicious cycle, which is at the heart of the report. And it's a vicious cycle that goes from insecurity to uncertainty to mistrust. And if left unchecked, this cycle of growing uncertainty and fragmentation threatens the fabric of societies. And the whole and the absolute basic social contract between citizens and governments. And it's also straining the very foundation of global solidarity, which threatens to lead to political gridlock, essentially. But before we move forward, let me then now pass the slides to my colleagues who will go more in depth into each one of these areas.
Thanks very much, Patricia. So now for the next 5 minutes, we would like to present some evidence from the report on the challenges that Patricia has mentioned. The first one is insecurity. Charles, Patricia have mentioned, and it's well known that extreme income poverty has declined rapidly since the 1990s. So has multidimensional poverty based on the measures we have. And yet, as Patricia has also said, many people feel insecure based on the results of a global survey on life satisfaction, about 60% of the global population say that they are struggling, and 12% say that they are suffering. So that's 75% of the global population not being okay. We have to listen to that. There are many reasons why people are not okay, and not all of them are economic, but the risk of falling into poverty is very present in many people's lives, and it's one of the reasons for this discontent. Many people succeed in rising above poverty to just fall back based on a minor shock, which can be just being sick, a minor disease, a bad crop, or for other minor reasons. To give one example, 80% of the population in South Africa has experienced poverty at some point between, I think, 2008 and 2014. Even if the extreme poverty rate was only 20%. So people move in and out. Poverty affects many more people than what we see in snapshots of poverty. The attached graph illustrates the dynamics of poverty for some countries. Let's focus, you see this bar, let's focus on the dark blue part of the bar. This shows the percentage of all the people who experience poverty, the percentage of people who are able to escape poverty and stay out of poverty for the periods shown on the left, which range between 4 and 15 years. The rest of the people who experience poverty either transitioned out of poverty and fell back down, or else became impoverished during the period or stayed in poverty for the full time. So the implication of that is that eradicating poverty is not only a matter of helping people move out the ladder, but it also involves preventing falls into poverty. And on that, we have not been successful. Now, one of the main reasons why the risk of poverty is so present in people's lives is the lack of decent job and access to social protection. In low and middle income countries, informal employment remains very high, and it has not declined despite expectations that it would. In fact, in Africa, the percentage of people working in formal employment has even increased since 2010, slightly, but it's not going down. And precarious work and lack of security in employment is not only present in low and middle income countries. In high income countries, there's a growing prevalence of part-time, temporary contracts, and other forms of casual work, which may give people choice and flexibility on where and when they work, but they are very precarious. Most people, based on the evidence that we present in the report, would prefer to work in more stable wage jobs if they had an opportunity to do so. Just very quickly, the graph on the right-hand side of the slide shows the percentage of workers who work on temporary contracts. It has increased from one cohort of workers to the next at all ages. This example is for Europe, but the same applies to other regions. So precariousness in the world of work has many detrimental consequences. First of all, for the social contract, it undermines the relationship between workers, employers, and governments. It affects trust, as Patricia will discuss later, and it keeps inequality very high. Inequality since 1995 has increased in most high-income countries and in many middle-income countries, shown in red in the graph. 65% of the population live in countries where income inequality has increased. It has also declined in some countries. However, even in those countries and regions where income inequality has declined, inequality remains very, very high. Let's put the example of Latin America, which is all usually presented as a success story. Brazil, especially of success in reducing inequality. The top 1% of the income distribution owns more than 20% of all income in Latin America on average. So income is increasingly concentrated at the top of the income distribution. And inequality between countries, which had been declining in the decades prior to the pandemic, is on the rise again. Just to give you an idea of the disparities, the average income of people living in sub-Saharan Africa is only 6% of the average income of people living in North America. In addition, a significant share of this inequality is due to characteristics such as ethnicity, place of birth, or family background that should have no impact on people's opportunities. In this graph, we show evidence from the report, selected evidence, on trends in child stunting and secondary school attendance for the poorest and richest quintiles of the population across countries. All the arrows are moving in the right direction, meaning all groups are making progress in terms of reducing child stunting and increasing secondary school attendance. However, the gaps are not closing. The poorest are not making faster progress than the richest quintiles of the population. So if trends continue as they are now, many people and groups will be left behind, not only by 2030, but well beyond that date. One last thing. You will have seen that these trends are attributed, these social challenges, these social crises, because we shall have to call it social crisis, are often attributed to the recent crisis, the pandemic, economic challenges, recent geopolitical conflicts. One key message of the report is that these challenges have been decades in the making. That in fact, policy choices that the development policy approach of the last decades premised on small government, privatization, deregulation in the name of economic efficiency has left many people behind. It has also been detrimental to those long-term and institutional investments that help create resilience against crisis and create fairer and cohesive societies, above all. So these crises were not inevitable, but now we found ourselves in a situation where there's a social backlash against and politics of anger arising. We are seeing it today in many countries, and these are the outcome of decades of leaving people alone in the face of growing risk. In today's angry climate, group identities are becoming increasingly divisive, often fueled by political movements that promote opposition and confrontation of our solidarity. It has become increasingly clear that this social situation, and now I'll let Patricia talk about distrust, which is an important component of this, is not sustainable. Patricia, back to you.
Thank you. And yes, indeed, that's a perfect entry point for the next slide. And one area that we focus quite substantially in the report is on the issue of trust. It's the bedrock of how relations, economic and social and political relations take place and how societies are organized. And what we see is these overlapping trends in insecurity and inequality are placing enormous strain on societies and eroding the social fabric that binds communities together. And that's essentially what we observe. And one particularly worrying trend is that of trust in institutions, in governments. Trust in institutions has sunk to alarming levels. Over half of the global population reports little or no trust in their government. This is also true of trust between individuals. Fewer than 30% of people in the world believe that most people can be trusted. Next slide, please. And what is particularly of great concern is the change across generations. These numbers have been increasing from one cohort to the next. The trust deficit has widened with each generation, which indicates a systemic breakdown in social cohesion. And as Marta just mentioned, it's the outcome of the problems that we see that have been in the making over the last decades. Just to give an example, almost a quarter of people born in the 1990s, now in their late 20s and early 30s, show no trust at all in their government. And if this trend continues, societies will become less and less trusting of institutions because social norms are transmitted across generations, and we know that. Next slide. And as trust in institutions and in other people decline, cooperation weakens, civic engagement fades, and polarization grows. And this is what we're witnessing as a consequence of these trends, a rising of the us versus them mentality that I spoke about before. And this is a concern, is a great concern, and it's a concern that's being amplified, for instance, through digital technologies, which are playing a role in these trends. Digital technologies hold enormous potential for connecting people and for accelerating social progress, and are part of how social movements gather and amplify voices, but they're also contributing to the erosion of social cohesion and trust. In particular, widespread mis and disinformation continues to fuel polarization and obstructs public dialogue and civic participation, as opposed to increasing public dialogue and increasing social consciousness. What can be done about this? Moving to the next slide. Fundamentally, the thing is how people feel about their own lives and the world around them matters for trust. And this includes, so it all comes down to how ordinary people absorb and experience these challenges. And this includes how people perceive their institutions to be delivering on their promises and responsibilities. And this is fundamental. This is the crux of the social contract. And as the report shows, perceptions of inequality and economic insecurity are linked negatively to trust in institutions. All that Marta spoke before are interlinked to these trends in trust. So it goes to show that at the very least, delivering on public services, on well-being is an important part of how governments build and maintain trust. And this is fundamental because it is absolutely crucial to the health of societies. Trust helps people navigate uncertainty. So in times of uncertainty, you would often social trust replaces other ways of coping. And what we're observing today is a combination of crisis and a lack of social trust. So it's a double whammy for many. And also this decline in trust matters for a variety of important outcomes, and there's very, very large amounts of evidence showing a correlation between trust and outcomes that range from peace building to maintaining the rule of law to ensuring people's willingness to cooperate, to participate and accept rules and norms. And fundamentally, trust matters for social cohesion both from local to global levels. So essentially the challenges we're facing require greater levels of cooperation and coordination at all levels, which becomes extremely difficult if social cohesion and trust continue down these trends. And now I pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Patricia. So what I'll do now is try to tie in the diagnostic that Marta and Patricia have presented here to talk about what can we do about this. And I mean, there's a lot of policy messages within the report. And so if you take away anything from this part of the report, I want you to remember 3 words: security, equity, and solidarity. And our main argument in the report is that those are the principles on which we need to base our policy actions in order to break this cycle. And I think, Patricia touched on it a bit right now, and a lot of these numbers can seem very abstract, especially when we're presenting at the global level. There's not a lot of disaggregation when you're trying to give a global picture of what the social situation is. But behind these numbers are people's lives. And these are things, their lived experiences, and their views and concerns can no longer be ignored because they have real consequences, as Patricia was saying, in terms of institutions, in terms of our political systems, and in terms of people's behaviors and their own well-being, and even their health and their mental health. So how can we break this cycle then, especially when a lot of these forces that we've covered today frustratingly shrink the space for policy action? And this was really the central question of the report, right? Because a lot of this analysis builds on research that we've done for other editions of the social report. And so this question is really what was driving the analysis. And I think one of the first conclusions we come to then is that clearly small changes won't fix this. This cycle cannot be broken without a complete rethink. And how we approach policy, how we approach governance, and how we think about everybody's roles and responsibilities in society. So we needed a fundamental shift to address the social crisis, and that's what we're calling a new policy consensus to unlock this vicious cycle and make it into a virtuous cycle. And what does that consist of? You'll see it, we've listed 3 key elements here in red. It's applying a social lens to policymaking. I'll go into more depth on what we think that looks like. Institutional and normative chains that foster trust and social cohesion, and then also stronger multilateralism to bring it back to what we can do at the multilateralist level. And, of course, we recognize that this shift will be difficult. A lot of the measures that fall within this, what we call the policy consensus, are going to challenge the status quo, especially if they're meant to tackle inequality and social exclusion. And so they're likely to encounter resistance. But the alternative of societies built on self-interest, defined by insecurity, inequality, exclusion, and distrust is simply not sustainable. And while the specific measures can vary according to the context, I want to go back to those 3 principles I mentioned at the beginning, because these principles are universal, and they're security, equity, and solidarity. And before moving on and talking a little bit more about the policy measures and the recommendations we make in the report, I do want to say that when we say a new policy consensus, we have to be clear that what's new is not the goals that we're talking about. We know what we want to achieve. The goals of the new policy consensus, they're already spelled out in the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development, in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and in the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we're rethinking here is the how we translate the vision of sustainable development contained in these agreements into action. And so first, just to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say applying a social lens to policy making. And of course, because where we sit, we always think of social policies first, and they're of course essential, but they're not enough. So what we're arguing for here is a social lens to all policy. And a social lens for policymaking calls for putting the reduction of insecurity, inequality, and the creation of decent work at the center of integrated and coherent policymaking. And really because social progress requires a whole of government policy framework. These piecemeal approaches that we've often taken will not work. And this is especially in the context of technological change, in demographic change, in climate change as well. A whole of government and comprehensive policy framework is necessary to ensure that measures that we take to try to take advantage of these global trends do not disproportionately or sometimes even unintentionally burden people living in poverty or other disadvantaged groups, but that we leverage these opportunities as an opportunity to promote inclusion and resilience. So what's also needed are critical investments in peoples and communities. And Patricia spoke a little bit about this. But what we emphasize in the report is that public spending on things like education, housing, health, energy, and other services, as well as decent work and universal social protection, are really key to promoting equal opportunity, as well as to promote social mobility across generations. But a lot of times, what we've seen is that macroeconomic policies narrowly focused on short-term stability and on balancing public budgets often constrain social investments when and where they're most needed. And I mean, I will say here, of course, we have to recognize that for a significant share of countries right now, fiscal space is increasingly constrained by the cost of debt servicing. But we feel like there are a lot of political choices that could still be made to open up spaces for domestic mobilization of resources. And as well, of course, there's a role in international cooperation to supporting that. So I'll move on now just to talk a little bit about fostering changes in institutions, norms, and values, because one of the things that we were thinking about is that whether societies hold together in environments of trust and cooperation, it's not a matter of policy alone. It requires shifts in norms and institutions to prioritize social cohesion over division, like Marta was saying, including by removing the systemic barriers that exclude people from economic, social, and political life. And really, institutions have little meaning if there's not trust in them, and if people don't abide by the rules that define how we live together. So a loss of trust that Patricia was showing in her slides really breaks down the legitimacy of institutions, and it weakens them in the long term. And the analysis that we have in the report shows that some of today's institutions are really struggling to adapt to a changing landscape, and they're falling short of people's expectations. And that's one of the reasons why we think that there's this lack of trust. When we talk about institutional change, of course, it's a long-term process. It's the result of many stakeholders, many actors in the field. But we do think that governments play a key role in taking that first step towards institutional change in terms of trying to build the normative framework around the societies that we'd like to see, and also in just signaling what the expected norms and shared values of our societies are. And so, it's really part of government's role to take that first step towards institutional change, and almost in a question of self-interest, because action is needed if the decline in trust and legitimacy is going to be reversed. I won't go too much into detail into the types of institutional change that we talk about, but some of the types that we talk about are in terms of addressing concentrations of power and wealth through inclusive and equitable institutions that help prevent and reduce the concentration of power and its arbitrary exercise. These are things in terms of access to justice, grounding equity in constitutional and legal frameworks, property rights, markets, including labor, housing, and land and credit markets that support the fair and just exercise of power. It also involves encouraging participation. And, you know, there's a lot of different things we can do in participation. There's a lot of great work that DESA's been doing in terms of e-governance and the democratization of government services through digital platforms. But a first step would be that ensuring that all people are officially recognized and counted, started with legal registration. To promote equity, ensure that every member of society can participate actively in economic and social life. And then finally, we talk about institutions that enable cooperation and solidarity. And here we highlight cooperatives as a prime example of an institution that can strengthen the bonds of solidarity between workers and employers, and then even between people and their governments. So just the last word then on stronger multilateralism for social progress. It's already come up a lot. And really, we have to talk about it here just because fostering deeper international cooperation and opening up spaces for deliberation at the global and national levels are key building blocks of this new policy consensus that we talk about. Basically because of our global world and humanity's interdependence. Like this is just where we need to be acting increasingly the way in which these global trends are shaping societies. It's very hard to address these issues in isolation without global cooperation. And so really we see the Second World Summit for Social Development as an opportunity to advance this new consensus and agree on concrete strategies to meet the commitments made in Copenhagen and the broader set of SDGs. And of course, the current geopolitical context presents challenges to achieving a consensus. It can feel like it undermines multilateral cooperation at a time when global solidarity is most needed. But really, I mean, we can't get discouraged. It can't lead to complacency or capitulation. On the contrary, they underscore the need for greater resolve. And in a sense, we're truly privileged to operate in this space, given that there's such strong engagement about what we think of as the core commitments on social development around poverty eradication, the reduction of inequality, decent work, and full employment and social inclusion. You know, these were core commitments of social development that are included in the 1995 Copenhagen Summit for Social Development. And we have an opportunity now with the summit in November to leverage the broad agreement around the importance and the centrality of these goals to preserve the global space for dialogue on these issues when it seems like global dialogue can be quite challenging. Yeah, so I would end with just saying now is not the time to back down, but to step up and defend the aims of social development as laid out in the Copenhagen Declaration and really advance a social perspective on sustainable development.
Thank you. Thank you, Maren and Patricia and Marta for that comprehensive presentation. And let me now move on to welcome again Shara and Andrew, who are joining us online as expert discussants. They've been involved as collaborators throughout the process for the report. And now they're going to give us some remarks and some reflections on this report. So Shara, let me first give the floor to you.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm sorry, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm extremely honored to be joining you. I'm sorry that I cannot be with you in New York, but it's really great to hear the presentation of the report. My involvement with the report was really more as a reader when the report was done, so I cannot claim any credit for the report, but I do want to congratulate all the authors for producing a report that is really, as we've seen with the presentation, but also reading through the report, a report that is very strong, very empirically grounded, conceptually very nuanced, as well as being extremely readable. I really enjoyed reading the report, and I must congratulate you for that. As a UN report, we sometimes have too many jargons, and I think this report was very refreshing. It was a very refreshing read. And of course, the content, and you've already highlighted some of the key points and findings. I think they're extremely timely, as we've already been hearing. I think the focus on prevention of falls into poverty, the strengthening of resilience in the face of growing threats, including climate change, of course, The need to really address the informality of employment, which you highlight quite a lot in both Global South, obviously, where it's very extensive, but also growing precarity of work elsewhere in the Global North as well. And the real, I think, importance of recognizing the challenge of inequality and the fact that we need major transformations. All of this, I think, resonates a lot with, I'm sure, many people. And I think the emphasis that you put on, and I'm quoting you here, this means pooling and sharing fairly the risks that people face as they move through life. You talk about enhancing, not only making social investments, but also enhancing the quality of investments. And then, the policy consensus based on those key three principles that you highlight of equity, of economic security for all, and of solidarity. I mean, this, I think, really, really kind of resonated very, very well. So I really, I don't have any critical remarks to give you, maybe just 3 points I thought, I might just highlight maybe to reinforce points that are already in the report. First, I think on labor markets, I think it's really important to highlight the fact that although there's been a lot of emphasis on the need to address income inequality, these kind of growing inequalities are driven by the fact that, the change in rhetoric has not really been accompanied by a kind of transformative changes in macroeconomic policies, in employment policies and strategies and social policies. In particular, I would say if we look at the labor share of income, this is another way of looking at inequalities, looking at the share that goes to labor versus profits, or what is sometimes called the functional distribution of income. What we see is that there has been a stagnation in the labor income share. It's only about 54% in 2022, and it has been stagnating. This creates real problems in terms of the kind of obviously income inequality that we see, but also constrains the ability of governments to generate revenues from social security contributions. Also, I think this whole challenge of reducing inequality or in this primary distribution of income. So therefore, this is a challenge that really needs to be, I think, addressed if we are to make any progress in reducing income inequalities, including also intergenerational social mobility. Again, staying on this theme of, I think, the labor market and informality, and you highlight the importance of extensive informality of employment. I would also say the informality of employment and informality of enterprises, which is also a major concern for many micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. This also exacerbates income inequalities and also restrains access to social insurance for workers who lack sufficient contributory capacities, but also it reduces the tax base for governments to mobilize resources. And I keep on emphasizing this issue of mobilizing of resources by governments because this is really also what you need in order to be able to finance the very important social investments that you talk about in the report. So this is just a few points I wanted to make on labor markets and the link with inequalities. Then on the second point I wanted to say was a little bit the need to question these kind of, and you do that very well, this separation of what we kind of call the economic, the social, and the political. You talk about applying a social lens. I also think it's useful to really talk about the way in which this separation of social and economic is an artificial divide in many ways. There's no doubt that income inequality is bad for societies. We know that it weakens social cohesion. It also leads to very poor health. Very good research from WHO showing how inequality exacerbates health inequity. So that's, I think, very important to also emphasize. But also high income inequality reduces economic growth. And this is research coming from IMF, from many kind of mainstream economic institutions, because access to education and opportunities for a large part of the population are restricted. So income inequality also has negative impacts if you only think in terms of economic growth. But also, I think inequality is very toxic because due to its tendency to trigger also crises, including financial crises and meltdowns, as well as the potential that it has to subvert regulatory and accountability institutions and to really subvert the quality of democracy. These issues have been very well articulated in the 2022 report on crises of inequality by UNRIS, and I think it's important to bring this into the analysis. So this separation of economic and social and political, I think we need to question, or we need to use, as you put it, a social lens when we look at all these issues. We need the social investments in order to protect the productive capacities of people and of enterprises and to avoid social and political stability. So these, the economic, the social, the political, there's really a lot of kind of flowing from one into another, and I think the separations can become very artificial. And my third and last point is around this challenge of solidarity. I think addressing many of the issues that you raise of, preventing people from falling into poverty in the first place, strengthening resilience, whether it's because of climate crises or other crises that we face, and reducing inequalities, both vertical and horizontal. All of this reinforces the urgency of building universal, robust, comprehensive social protection systems rather than falling back on kind of ad hoc safety nets that are not very reliable, they're not very safe, and they're not very solid if societies are to navigate the increasingly volatile and crisis-prone kind of world that we're in. But this means solidarity. It requires very broad risk pooling. We need that form of solidarity, which traditionally we have, thought about in terms of very universal social insurance programs that bring different groups of people together, those with stronger contributory capacities together with those with lower income and lower contributory capacities, those who have health preconditions with younger, more healthy populations, so that you really can create this kind of solidarity in financing, which is really key rather than have these very segmented systems, of private insurance for those who can afford it and who have better health conditions and so forth, and then very kind of overstretched systems that are publicly financed and offer not of very high quality because of the lack of financing for those systems. And this segmentation where people are unwilling to pay taxes and social security contributions because they feel that they're not benefiting for those systems if those systems are only for the very poor. So how do we create that kind of fiscal contract and social contract and create those mechanisms for solidarity? I think this is the really big question for how we need to create these universal social protection systems that are really universal, because at the moment we have a bit less than 50% of the world's population that has no social protection to fall back on. And these significant coverage gaps are at the end of the day because of financing gaps. So we really need to be thinking about how to create those fiscal contracts, how to bring the taxes and the social security contributions to create solidaristic systems that can really be robust, be universal, be adequate, as you rightly say. It's not a question of just having coverage, but adequate coverage. So this requires, the whole financing issue needs to become also quite central to our thinking about how to rebuild trust and how to create solidarity in very unequal societies. So this is really, I think, the challenge that we're facing. And my last point is that, looking forward, of course, we need integrated public policies. Social protection on its own is never going to be the answer. And we really need these coordinated policies that you highlight. That's absolutely key, integrated public policies. And we hope that the discussions around the Second World Summit for Social Development, the Financing for Development conference that's coming up, will really be able to create the kind of powerful coalitions that we need to address issues of inequality and of how to rebuild solidarity in a very fractured and unequal world. So let me stop here, and I'm sorry if I went a little bit over my time limit.
Thank you so much, Shara, for certainly deepening the discussion, especially on labor markets, on the issues of social protection and integrated policy. Let me now give the floor to Andrew, from Director of the Chronic Poverty. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And I just said that partly to check that you can hear me in the room. You can hear me? Yes? Not so good? Maybe I need to sit a bit closer to my microphone. Is that any better?
Slightly improved, very muffled.
Yeah, not muffled.
It's muffled. Oh, okay. I will come even closer. I will speak slowly. If I speak slowly, maybe you can follow me. Should I continue, or should I ask you to move on to the next speaker?
Let's try. Let's give it a try, Andrew.
Please continue.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me again. It's very good to see the UN leading long-term thinking about development and the challenges in the current conjuncture, which are, as has been pointed out, very considerable. And it's very good to see a focus on issues like trust and social cohesion, because I think this will motivate serious discussion about the policy issues and the political issues behind those policy issues at the summit and around the summit. So I think the report has done a very good job on that level. I will perhaps focus on one or two details in the report just to bring out some issues which I feel are really important. First of all, like Shahara, I think the focus on economic insecurity and informal economies and the importance of informal economies is a very good focus. This is a very challenging area where the policies that have been pursued of formalization and regulation, and often by governments of taxation and sometimes even harassment, have not really benefited the majority of operators in the informal economy. And I think there is big scope for change in policy, change in thinking, innovative work on the ground. And I'm delighted to see the report has given a lot of emphasis to this issue. And I know that I think I'm correct in saying that the International Labour Congress this year is also going to be focusing on this issue very strongly. So I think if the World Social Summit and the International Labour Congress focus on it, that will be very good. I would say that the human development policies and programs, which get a lot of, quite correctly, get a lot of emphasis in the report, are very good at supporting the operators in the informal economy to increase skills, to improve health, to improve the protection that they can experience. But we also need to go beyond that in terms of innovative work. We need to think about how growth from below can be supported by policies, whether it is financial inclusion, whether it is skills, occupational health and safety, and so on and so forth. So there's a very big need to develop, to extend some of the good policies relating to the formal sector into the informal economies, and to give more chances, not only to the top 3% of informal economy operators, but to a much bigger number, a much bigger proportion of them. So this would be my first reflection. And a second reflection related to this is that people in the informal economy are, as has been pointed out, very vulnerable, need protection, and crisis management, disaster risk management, becomes an incredibly important aspect of our modern policy making. Often, and this relates to the points about preventing impoverishment. Often they are not emphasized enough, not given enough priority by government, and possibly in the international community as well, and rely too much on ad hoc actions. So I think that's an area, and within that, people are bound to lose out. They are bound to lose assets, suffer hardship because of crises. We need to re-emphasize the recovery process. I was very struck in the pandemic that many countries developed recovery programs, but then moved on to other issues before those recovery programs were implemented. And the relief measures also finished way too early, so that recovery from the pandemic was not possible for many people. So I think recovery needs a much bigger emphasis. I would like to congratulate you on the idea of bringing a social lens to policy making in general. I think this is excellent. And some of the specific emphases that you mentioned, I think are also really important, and really important in the 21st century context. So you emphasize housing policy a lot. This is an area where there is, again, a lot of innovation needed, a lot of new thinking needed, but it's really important because as with the informal economies, they are routes out of poverty for many people and need to be reinforced. Housing can also be a route out of poverty, and it can also be an aspect of becoming poor, because if you are in a crisis, you borrow money, you can't pay your rent, you get thrown out of your rental accommodation, and you're on a downward spiral. So in many aspects, particularly for urban people, urban vulnerable people, urban poor, housing is an incredibly important sector. And you also draw attention to energy and electrification. And we find in our work that electrification is one of those triggers for escapes and sustained escapes out of poverty in many different situations. And we know that electrification can be done. We know it can be done in a green way. So, for example, I was just reading the latest poverty report from Rwanda. Rwanda, like one or two other countries before it, has electrified very rapidly. And both electrification and various other aspects like improved healthcare are leading to reduced poverty in Rwanda at a time when in many other countries in the region, poverty has been increasing. So I think those two emphases are both challenging. We know what to do in the case of energy. We don't know what to do in the case of housing. It needs much more innovation. But I like the fact that you raised those as agenda items. I would like to just give a couple more comments. The first one is just to say that some work that we have done recently on integrating economic, social, and environmental policy making has found that no countries are doing really well on all three areas at the same time. So the outcomes, we looked at outcomes over a long period of time. No countries are really doing well on all three, but some countries are doing modestly well on all three over quite a long period of time. And those are all countries which are doing well on social inclusion. So I think this probably indicates that if you want an integrated policy framework, if you can really crack the social inclusion nut, that will be very helpful in getting through to a more integrated approach, the kind of approach that the SDGs are encouraging. And then my last thought is that, my goodness, this is a challenging agenda that you have here. the dysfunctional social trends, which the report very properly points up, are all extremely challenging. This is going to need a coalition which is much stronger than the current coalition around the SDGs. The UN has laid a fine basis for this coalition, getting private sector interest, and enthusiasm and support, and civil society organizations behind the SDGs. This is a fantastic, this is really an excellent basis, but it's going to need to be much stronger in the face of the challenges and that you mentioned, that the report mentions. And I hope that some attention will be given to how that coalition can be built and strengthened at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and Shara again. And now please let me open the floor up to questions, either here or remember, also online, you can answer your question on the Q&A. Please, the floor is open for any questions. And comments as well, of course, reactions, questions, anything.
Thank you for this report. It's really, I have always read it, like, not in full, but it's really a good report, I can say, particularly on the issue of connecting the fiscal policies with the social policies. And we just had an orientation on the financing for development this morning, and they were talking about even in the World Bank and IMF discussions, there's already the link between the financing and the social issues. And I think my question is in relation to the connection between, is there work being done about connecting this report to the Financing for Development conference that's happening, where in the outcome document that's being negotiated at the moment, social protection is only in 3 paragraphs. And we are actually asking that hopefully it doesn't get dropped off. It wasn't in the initial ones, but hopefully in those 3 paragraphs that it doesn't get dropped off, because we know social protection is a poverty alleviation tool. It has helped, and same with my experience. So that's one question. The other question is, I'm very interested about your comments on the income disparity, inequality. Because I think one thing that we also need to look at is the income disparity between the CEOs and the workers. Whereas in previous, like only maybe 10, 20 years ago, it was like 40 to 50%. Now we're looking at hundreds, not even just 100%. Like the disparity in the minimum wage and the CEO's income, salaries, and the whole package is, I think, driving some of these issues as well. So we're very interested to know if you had any research on that, but also is that driving also the disillusion and the lack of not just insecurity for workers, but their lack of seeing this income disparity even within the countries, let alone among other countries. That is it also fueling this insecurity? Sorry, not the insecurity, this lack of trust. And also, sorry, one last thing in relation to social protection. I'm from a country where it's becoming, it's a place where private sector is entering into the social protection services, and we are seeing a preference for profit than for service. And we think, and I think that's going to be an issue in the future. If we're inviting public sector in this space, there needs to be a real robust checks and balances. Thank you.
Before we turn back to our panelists for answers to those wonderful questions, is there any other question or comment? Cecilia.
So Congratulations, first of all. This is an excellent, it's been an excellent presentation, so I'm really looking forward to doing a deep dive into this document. And I have a question both from my hat as a representative with the DIC, but also from my hat as the focal point for the NGOC subcommittee on the World Social Summit. So I think it's clear that this report really has a nuanced, complete, complex read of the social situation. And I'm thinking about how a lot of the unspoken assumptions that inform these inequalities and the lack of security and the lack of trust that we've talked about today is really on that basis of how people are viewing each other and interacting with each other. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how this new social policy consensus that you've talked about would permeate decision-making, and what are the changes in the mindset and the attitudes that would be needed for that new policy consensus to then, become active on the decision-making.
Thank you so much. And you have a question.
So, hello everyone. My name is Jillian D'Souza. I'm part of the NGO Committee for Social Development, and it seems like this is going to be mandatory reading for everybody. Thank you so much and congratulations on the publication. And my question really stems around the fact of ahead of November. Is there a plan around how we can use this report to shift or inform minds inside the room and outside while they come to some kind of decision using this document? Do you have a plan around it, or are there any thoughts about how to use this ahead of November? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, with these three questions, let me turn back to our speakers and open the floor to you to respond.
Okay, so let's start by the order in which the questions were posed. Maybe on FFT4, sorry, I'm not so sure how this report is going to inform it. Yes, we know, and Sharon knows better than anyone, that social protection has not been at the forefront of the discussions yet. I mean, there's no plan to bring this to FFT4, but hopefully it will inform it. I don't know. I'll let other colleagues respond to this one. In terms of income inequality, you mentioned wage disparities or disparities in compensation. Yes, Sharon mentioned before that the labor share of income has already been declining. Okay, that's one type of inequality. Within the labor share, wage inequality was growing for a while. It's not anymore, but it has plateaued at a very high level. We have numbers in the report. I don't know them by heart. I know that it's very high in the country, in the host country, for example. But one thing to highlight is that these increases in inequalities in wages have come with declines in trade unionization, where unions were a strong force, right? And declines in trade unionization have also come with a weakening of the identity of workers. The working class of the past no longer exists. It has been splintered because of all this precarization of work, because of the fact that we have many types of work now where people don't work together in a factory or in an office, right? Because they are invisible, they work at home, they work against another, they compete one against the other. So there has been a weakening of the working class as a force for change in general. And that's, I think, an important reason behind increases in inequality of all kinds. I don't wanna absorb all the questions, but what was there? The privatization of social protection, indeed. I mean, I think the minuses of privatizing social protection programs, and again, we have Shara here, has been already, we have evidence of how bad that was. There were extreme cases like in Latin America, for example, of privatization of social protection that created such a backlash that then the private sector or the public sector had to come back in. And Shara has mentioned already the effects of these tier systems where you have some voluntary social protections that people can sign in, and then a basic floor that is so basic that at the end only people in poverty use it, and then services for the poor become poor services because nobody advocates for improving the quality of such services. So that's some answer, but I'll let my co-authors. Oh, I forgot anything else. Okay.
Patricia?
Shall I come in?
Of course.
Okay. Okay, let me address the first question on linking financing and social issues. I think it's absolutely crucial, especially given the current events that we're facing. In fact, at UNY, we've been working quite a lot on these issues. And just to give you some flavor about the magnitude of the problem, about 3.3 billion people currently live in countries that spend more on debt interest than on education and health. And by the end of 2025, Global South governments will spend around, on average, 47% of their budgets on debt servicing, way above any expenditure on social services. I mean, this just tells us all, right? We want to increase social inclusion. We want to increase social protection, and this involves a whole series of social policies which are dependent on financing. And currently, most of the fiscal space of developing countries goes into servicing debt. So this has to be solved. This is a conundrum that will have to be solved, and I do hope it's at the heart of the FF4D conference. And of course, the three areas that are being discussed with and where we need absolutely innovative solutions, because what's been done so far is really not working, is on domestic revenue mobilization. There's a lot of naivety about how much fiscal space can actually be created in countries, in developing countries themselves, but that will be the topic of a whole, we could have the entire hour and a half today just around that issue. Then we have the issue of debt restructuring, which is being discussed. You cannot increase the space for investment in social sectors without solving that problem. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about how we can unlock private sector financing, given current substantial reductions in development cooperation and aid. These are enormous questions, and they'll go. You're absolutely right. They'll go in tandem. I don't, this policy consensus will very much be dependent on what is the fiscal space created, given current constraints to aid, essentially. And that's definitely something we probably need to push. This is addressing the final question: how could you better use this report to actually push some of these agendas? Is precisely at that level. We are showing that a lack of investment in these sectors is creating a whole series of problems that will be very, very hard to address. It's breaking social contracts across the world. It's breaking trust in governments. And therefore, if this is not addressed, then we have very bleak times ahead. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Just 30 seconds real quick, just to pick up on some questions I think you didn't answer. I mean, one of your questions was, does this rise in inequality affect trust in institutions? And we didn't actually get to include this in the presentation, but there's a lot of research that's been done that it's not actually the level of inequality, but also how people perceive inequality that has a stronger relationship to trust. So a lot of times people try to make that connection and say there's not a connection, but it's more of a causal chain of inequality, perception of inequality, and then a decline in trust. And a question too, I just wanted to say really quickly about the privatization of public services. Latin America is the case that I know the best, and the privatization, for instance, of the pension system in Chile. And a lot was done about that and about how it didn't work. And it speaks to a fundamental question, I think, a little bit to what Cecilia was saying, what's your aim, your final aim in providing these services? Is your aim efficiency? Is it economic gain? No, you have to think about what's your objective at the end, right? And there's this, I think, a false narrative around if public sector came in they could do a better job than the public sector. The private sector could do a better job than the public sector in terms of the provision of a lot of these services under a false model of efficiency. But if economic efficiency is not what we're seeking to gain in these policies.
Thank you. Okay, we need to give Daniel a few minutes for his closing remarks. However, I'm being told that we have one question from Carlos, who is going to ask his question online. Let me see if that works.
Carlos Maldonado.
Carlos Maldonado.
Hi, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me well. This is Carlos Maldonado from ECLEC. I just wanted to share a question and, well, above all, congratulations on the report. But I just wanted to say that this report shows that trust or mistrust is essential to social cohesion. But one difficulty that we find is how do we articulate a policy agenda on trust or mistrust? How can we actually build a coalition or a policy agenda on this particular issue? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Patricia, do you want to just maybe give a response in as little time as possible as we need to close? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. So another great question that would probably take us another hour and a half. But I think, I mean, very the way we sort of see trust here is a bit of it as a symptom of other problems that have been in the making, as Martha mentioned. Rising inequality, but fundamentally rising economic insecurity across various areas, from informality to lack of employment, social protection, etc. If we really trace back, trust is something that doesn't change a great deal across time, hence why these numbers are so problematic. But if we want to trace the largest shift that happened, you trace it back to the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And fundamentally what we had there is a great amplification of economic uncertainty, which then drove everything else. So the reason why it's probably, I mean, you couldn't have just a sort of policy agenda on trust without bringing the economic aspects of it into it, because the way we're seeing fundamentally, it is a symptom of something that is fundamentally wrong at the way economies and societies are organized currently.
Thank you, Patricia. Shara, I see you have your hand up. Let me go to you very, very quickly.
Yeah, I'll try and be very quick. Just wanted to come in on the financing for development and social protection. I mean, I think when the elements paper for the financing for development came out, there was absolutely no reference to social protection. And, we have a global partnership that's called USP 2030, which includes governments, international organizations, civil society, academic institutions. It's a partnership that's co-led by the ILO and the World Bank. We're the two co-chairs of USP 2030. And we have a financing working group as part of this USP 2030 partnership. So we kind of, made quite a bit of noise, and we put out a call to action, which we looked at how social protection had been extended over the past 9 years. This was the data that we had, global data over the past 9 years, and we could see that some of the more more active countries had extended social protection by about 2 percentage points per annum. So we said, based on this data, this can be done. It's realistic. Extension of social protection by 2 percentage points per annum. So this became part of this global call to action. And we really mobilized and tried to sort of persuade member states, because after all, FFD document is not, we are observers. It's member states that are driving this agenda. But we were very happy that there was quite a lot of reception for this from many governments, including initially Brazil and then South Africa and others. And I believe it's still now. So we got some traction for it, and I think there was a lot of also suggestions from member states during the negotiations. So in the zero draft that came out, there are more references to social protection. It's much better compared to the elements paper. That was the pre-zero draft. So it's there, and the reference to 2 percentage points is there as well. But but these will be negotiated, and we'll have to see how that will move forward. But what I do want to emphasize is that, you know, we've done a whole analysis of the financing gap for having a social protection floor, and we know that countries need to increase the mobilization of resources in order to be able to even create that basic social protection floor. And there are different policy options. I mean, there's, you know, social security contributions, different forms of taxation, particularly progressive taxation, wealth taxes that are getting quite a bit of traction in the FFD process, which is very good news. And then there's, of course, you know, a whole question around what kind of a global financial architecture we need in order to really enable many developing countries to mobilize resources rather than have, you know, illicit financial flows and have the kind of debt distress that Patricia was referring to, which is really sort of eating away in the fiscal space that countries can have for investment in social protection and public services, given that they have to kind of service this debt that they have. And if I just want to say one point on this whole question of trust, I mean, I think the whole kind of era of states kind of letting go of many areas of social responsibilities that they had really created the basis for, I think, that this kind of fraying of the social contract and lack of trust in a state that is only seen when it comes out, you know, with a police and law and order, and not the kind of social state that is providing quality services, that is providing social protection, that is really, you know, the state that is required in terms of international human rights and social security standards. Social protection systems need to be overseen by the state. They have the primary responsibility for ensuring that the system is in place, its governance is adequate, that financing for it comes in regularly, there's good governance of the financial flows and so forth. So I think states have, in a way, undermined their own credibility and eroded trust, and we need to have that social state to come back again and really create that solidarity between states and, you know, citizens or residents to build that trust. It's not a magic bullet. It needs to be done gradually and over time. And I think social protection and investment in public services is a very good way of beginning to rebuild that social trust. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shara. And my apologies to Andrew and to any other hand that we may leave unanswered. However, we need to move on to our closing remarks as we have a time limit on the room. So forgive us, Andrew, and please, Daniel, over to you.
Sure. So I realize that I am sitting between you and lunch, which is always the best place to be. So I have a food analogy, and I'll be very brief, I hope. So I think many of you have heard me speak before about onions. And onions are the reason that I think this report is so important, and why I think DISD remains my favorite division at the UN. Because if you think about how we talk about policy and how we talk about the issues afflicting humanity, we're often at maybe one or two layers of the onion. We talk about poverty, we talk about inequality, and then we talk about the policies to express them. But this report and the contributions today go far deeper than that. It's actually what I would say is at the center of that onion. They talk about the narrative, which I think is at the heart of everything. What is our narrative that we want? It's about interdependence, it's about solidarity. And then how is that expressed? Well, it's got to be expressed through trust and trustworthiness, through shared society and through justice. All of these things have been referenced today. And now what are the policies that build on these? Well, those would then produce equality and solidarity and security. And we have many policies here that have been discussed that I need to mention. And then this, as we reduce inequality and we promote solidarity and reduce insecurity, we then reduce poverty and all the outward expressions that we see of the human suffering, which then would fix that perception problem. And so what you've done here is you've actually cut through the whole onion in one report, rather than just staying at the superficial level. And just to take the opposite side, what we have in society is at the center, it's about selfishness and isolation. And then how is that expressed? Well, it's expressed through self-interest and through competition. What are the policies that reflect self-interest and competition? That's where we start to see inequalities and poverty and these perceptions of suffering come out. So what you've done is you've sort of compared the rotten onion that we're working with to the fresh onion that we want. And I am just very grateful to you for doing so, because it actually gets to all the layers of what we're seeing in society. And I hope that we can take Jillian's implicit advice to use this report well, to understand it well, and to advocate it among our friends and colleagues and member states, who are responsible for many of the achievements that we all are seeking. So with that, I'll stop and you can go get some onions on whatever it is you're planning to eat for lunch. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for online.